Hey folks, it's September 30th, it's Tuesday, and it has been fascinating to watch these two tropical storms, tropical cyclones spinning just off the eastern coast. The sort of model updates over the last 72 hours have been somewhat jarring. Imelda at one point, most model solutions taking it in toward a potential landfall somewhere in the Carolinas. That started to update maybe Saturday and then ultimately into Sunday, where it was clear that Umberto, reaching Cat 5 strength over the weekend, was strong enough, along with this trough just to the west, to pull and kind of tug Imelda ultimately away from the Carolinas. Now, we have seen moisture. You can see that streaming up here from the south. That has brought rainfall to the drought-stricken Carolinas, but not expecting, as Eric discussed yesterday, that landfall that we were maybe worried about more so at the end of the week, last week. Umberto spinning to the east here. It has been, comparatively the much stronger storm. I mentioned reaching Cat 5 status over the weekend, but actually Imelda looks a little bit better. If I scrutinize them here this morning, I think Umberto is still a Cat 2, but weakening very quickly, maybe down to like a Cat 1 at this point, before this video gets recorded. But Imelda spinning here and has a little bit more vigorous thunderstorms rotating around it. Umberto starting to lose the cirrus deck definition here. You can see some of those values kind of struggling. And then the low-level center, I know this is hard to see, but these like low clouds on infrared are starting to almost like get out from underneath the storm. And the expectation actually that Imelda might further strengthen today in relation to Umberto, but both moving to the east critically. I'll talk about that pathway in a second. Could be significant for potential wind event, one of these sting jet events that we're worried about, maybe in Ireland and the British Isles later this week. Closer across the continental U.S., we can see a weak trough spinning across here, just some high clouds across the plains and southern plains, a few showers getting to the ground here underneath in Oklahoma, Texas, the Red River area, but actually it looks better on infrared than it does maybe on radar or in surface observations right now. More so focused over on the western U.S., where we've seen an initial plume of moisture come in and come over the higher elevations there, but the deeper low pressure responsible for the weekend, or I should say the weekly rainfall, I think ultimately for a lot of these states further to the west. In fact, you can just see those infrared returns starting to come on screen there. In fact, I'm going to just jump over. Let's see if we can do this quickly. We can look at that low on infrared. There it is. So we'll get a look visible when the sunrise moves over to the western U.S. later here this morning. See that low pressure spinning west of Washington and British Columbia. And this is going to be the weather maker for the Willamette Valley, portions of Washington, Northern California over the next 48 hours or so. It is going to be interesting, I think, to watch these tropical cyclones play off one another. We mentioned this kind of Fujiwara effect where they orbit around one another. Part of that has been Umberto kind of pulling Imelda further away. Now, Umberto expected to strengthen over the coming days, but Imelda, at least over the next 24 hours, could see it reach, Cat 2 later on this week, and then ultimately kind of merge and transition from these tropical, what we call these warm core systems, into ultimately a hybrid earthing cold core system as it wraps up into like a proper mid-latitude cyclone or extratropical cyclone, as we call them, ultimately coming all the way and potentially impacting Ireland. We'll take a look at that in a second here. But man, just seeing how close these are in proximity, within maybe like 600 miles or so, you can see this kind of neat saddle point between the flow here. This is a rare occurrence, something we might not see for a number of years, just two systems spinning so close to one another at near hurricane strength for both storms. If we jump over and look at the upper level ones here this morning, I'm going to back this up over North America. See this ridge here positioned across kind of the interior of the continent. Here is this large upper level trough responsible for the additional weather we're expecting across the western U.S., maybe northern plains. We'll look at that in a minute here. But it's this sort of weak trough right here that has allowed Imelda to push a little bit further to the east and ultimately get under the influence of Umberto as these are slowly ushered to the east over the coming days here. If we look across radar here this morning, there's that precipitation, that moisture getting into the mid-Atlantic, portions of the Carolinas here. You can see Imelda spinning just out of the reach of the radar here off the coast of Florida. It's kind of neat to see that when they come closer and closer. But a nice rains in here. It wasn't nearly as much as we were worried about. In fact, kind of the better solution here where got some rain on the drought here, but without that critical flooding risk that we were worried about at the end of Friday. That moisture across the west, that initial plume, you can see rainfall in here from the Snake River Valley through the elevations of northern Idaho, western Montana, into central Nevada as well. If we just look over the last 24 hours of that precipitation, you can see North Carolina, South Carolina, even Virginia getting some of that precipitation from Imelda's moisture plume with some more higher values there along the coast. And then over in the western U.S., the Willamette Valley, western Washington coast, And Northern California is seeing some of that precipitation from that initial wave that we're now seeing move over Idaho and Nevada here this morning. I mentioned I'm curious to see the development of these two cyclones as they move further to the east. We're looking at the ECMWF. Zoom this in, make this a little bit bigger. We get 850 millibar winds. So these aren't the winds getting all the way to the surface, but they're indicative of maybe like gust potential, which is going to be relevant for Ireland later this week. But man, just watch these slowly sort of play off one another. They kind of orbit around one another. It's very unique to see this scenario play out. And then all the while, these are going to be merging with that trough and transitioning into a proper extratropical cyclone at some point here over the next 3 to 5 days. And this is going to strengthen into a strong 960 millibar low, one of these North Atlantic storms, which is going to bring significant sting jet and wind potential to Ireland and maybe even further to the east over the British Isles here. So there's still kind of a hybrid system lingering in the North Atlantic, but the parent system that forms in that mid-latitude cyclone bringing significant wind gusts. You're talking up near like 158, 160 kilometer gusts here per hour. So it's an impressive event. You're getting close to like 100 miles an hour wind event in terms of the gusts here. This forecast just from the ECMWF. So, whether it's here in like Connaught or like further near like Killarney, is it clear yet? We're a little bit too far out in the forecast, all the way like Friday evening at this point. But impressive event related to Umberto and Imelda kind of merging here over the next 2 or 3 days. Want to focus more on that western precipitation. If we jump over and look at the 3-kilometer NAM, this is the simulated radar forecast from that model. I'm going to play this forward here. This is going to take us through. Let's see if I can reset this. There we go. Play it forward here into this morning, about 7 a.m. Central Time. You can see additional rainfall expected here this morning over the Carolinas and Virginia. We saw some of that on radar. Some of this likely weakening all the while today on Tuesday as Imelda Umberto move a little bit further to the east. But if you look in this afternoon, 4 p.m. Central Time, 2 p.m. Pacific, much stronger plume of moisture now coming onshore. California, Oregon, Western Washington, moving over the Willamette Valley, the Seattle-Tacoma area this evening. Some shower and storm activity in Montana, but not widespread. That activity kind of waning through the overnight hours before that low pressure system that we saw just earlier on infrared, getting closer and closer to British Columbia there, getting more precipitation getting over kind of the Olympic Mountains there. Taking this through Wednesday evening, you can see just light showers now across Oregon, California, maybe even getting into the Sacramento Valley a little bit here, but not widespread precipitation amounts. Before finally getting out into Thursday morning, you can see some precipitation over in Montana. Now, all the while, if you're looking at the eastern 3/4, 4/5 of the continent, if you will, anywhere kind of like east of that line, not a lot of precipitation. You see weakening shower returns across the southern plains here today. I'm kind of fast forwarding. Can't rule out a shower or two across the Dakota areas today. If we just look over the next kind of 3 days of precipitation from that NAM forecast, outside of some showers at the elevations here along the Appalachians here in the Carolinas associated with Imelda, maybe some weak showers over Minnesota and the Dakotas. But outside of that west precipitation, we are just continuing this drier trend across the next 7 days in the continent. Now, I only took this out, 60 hours, so close to 3 days here. But if I took this all the way 7 days, the pattern doesn't budge much from what it's showcasing over the next 3. We do have a system sneaking through the northern plains, the upper Midwest. I'll talk about in a second here. In fact, let's just jump over and look at that really quickly. Here's the ECMWF forecast for precipitation. If I play this through tonight, we kind of talked already about this. Into Thursday, you can see Nevada, the Sierra Nevadas, maybe even some snowfall here. The upper elevations, this is on Friday afternoon. And that low gets into Wyoming, now Saturday evening, and then ultimately overnight Sunday morning. See that low pressure system here, kind of more of a pressure trough, bringing precipitation from Minnesota through the Dakotas into western Nebraska. Snowfall for the elevations in Wyoming, maybe northern Colorado. See some of the rainfall values there this weekend. It quickly races east, see additional precipitation across the southeast, particularly along the Gulf Coast states here. But racing through that cold front and weakening, not at that best angle for widespread precipitation as it quickly moves through. And then maybe seeing a spin up late next week, like Wednesday or Thursday, and almost kind of like your nor'easter pattern, a little bit early for those. But the way it kind of spun up like a Miller B system, sort of interesting there. Might be seeing some sort of system come out of the Eastern Pacific. We're going to talk about that at the end of the video, particularly the operational ECMWF, a little bit more bullish that something gets up here, maybe into the southwest. That is not guaranteed at this point. In fact, some of the other model runs keeping most of the tropical activity further to the south with less of a moisture plume. That's all to say, aside from the East Coast and the Gulf Coast states next week, this is just one scenario. We're all the way out at 10 days, so can't put a Sharpie pin in this one yet, but not a lot of precipitation chances for the Ohio Valley, for the Midwest, an area that's been dry. In fact, we just jump over and look at those soil moisture values. We had rain, right, last week, but it wasn't as much as I think we thought in some of these areas here. And so Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Ohio, even all the way over toward like the Missouri River Valley, still seeing some widespread dryness. You can pick on some areas here across the Gulf Coast states, certainly the Carolinas that have been drier before Imelda's influence. And this is an area that's continuing to stay dry through, a busy harvest season at this point, at the end of September and early October. And part of the reason for this sort of dry, persistent, and some of the warmth that we've seen, I think, over the last 30 days or so, has been, simply putting it, the jet stream has been retracted further to the north, further near the North Pole. And if we look at the jet stream here this morning, the flow across the North Pacific, it's actually relatively vigorous. That's what's helping to produce and influence that trough in the low pressure system coming on shore in Washington and Oregon. But we've seen a lot of troughs in this area here, and what goes down in the atmosphere tends to go up and vice versa. And so we've seen ridging build into the interior of North America. We've seen big blue H's, high pressure systems, spilling out of Canada, coming into the kind of the Midwest or the East Coast, keeping precipitation values low in this area here, keeping heat on the rise. And we're seeing that same pattern here today. Now, Eric mentioned yesterday in the forecast that at the very least, we're taking this pattern and reversing it. And what I mean by that is, instead of kind of a deeper, vigorous trough over the Northeast Pacific, we're replacing it with perhaps, an omega block. But I agree with Eric, an omega block isn't necessarily that much better for returning flow, for returning troughs to the Midwest or to the southern or central plains, or even all the way over to the Ohio River Valley, because while it does kind of stir up the pattern maybe in the western U.S., if we replace that trough with a ridge here in the Northeast Pacific, it tends to make things rather stagnant downstream with not a lot of these low pressure systems moving west-east. This one, this graphic I put together yesterday, this forecast now for Sunday, does keep this trough here across the western U.S. We do have systems kind of moving through the northern plains, but you saw those weren't particularly wet either, outside of kind of a thin or relatively narrow corridor across the plains in like Minnesota. As that front moved further to the east, you didn't see widespread precipitation values along with it. So while this omega block reverses the pattern a little bit, it's not like this widespread, okay, here comes the troughs, the parade of troughs, here comes the frost line, etc. But it is interesting. It's kind of shaking the pattern up just a bit, which might have potential to get things moving a little bit more as we go into like the middle part of October. This forecast for this weekend, only October 5th at this point. Now, if we just look over like the last 30 days of the jet stream anomalies, so where has the jet stream been stronger versus where has it been weaker? Particularly, we're looking for areas on this map where it's flowing stronger west to east, your proper jet stream. And so I'm just going to follow that across the North Pacific here over Siberia. Jet stream has been stronger further to the north over Siberia. That has actually continued over through the North Pacific, where it's been flowing up into Alaska, coming around kind of the Canadian archipelago, before barreling down into this large upper level ridge here over North America. That is that ridge. That's that source of high pressure that we talked about. But really kind of continuing this experiment, moving all the way through kind of the North Atlantic. And where has it been weaker? It's been weaker further to the south. And so what this is really showing us, this kind of weakness here in the North Central Pacific, north of Hawaii here, is that the jet stream has been further to the north. So areas where it should be stronger are further to the south, and areas where it has been stronger have been further to the north, kind of that shunted to the north jet stream. Now, part of this is certainly likely related to a lot of this warmth that we've seen build into the North Pacific this year. This has been a feature that Eric and I have talked about in just about every video here at the end of summer, going into early fall, likely pushing that jet stream further to the north than it otherwise would be. And this has been a pattern that we've seen over the last 4 years. In fact, I went back and I said, show me the September temperature anomalies across the North American continent for the last 4 years, 24, 23, 22, and 21, which we know have been years where the North Pacific has been warmer than not, particularly so in some of those years. versus just the 20 years before. So it's not like I'm comparing 2021 or 2022 to like 1981 or 1951, just 2000 to 2019. And when we do that, we see how warm that we've been over almost all of Canada, central and southern plains, even over into the Midwest, maybe a little bit cooler in the southeast. Some of this likely rainfall, kind of clouds and precip related. Look at how warm we've been. I want to say the interior, but even almost all the way over to the coastline. You can see that warmth, that influence of those stronger sea surface temperatures, those warmer sea surface temperatures in the North Pacific, helping to push that jet stream north. Alaska's actually been cooler in these Septembers over the last 4 years, again, likely related to that jet stream pushing in, maybe precipitation. But it has been this kind of critically persistent feature of the Septembers of late. And maybe it's something we'll have to keep an eye on in 2026 or 2027 if we see that warmth build in. This has also been at times associated with the fall drought that we've seen build in across various portions of the Mississippi Valley in fall as well. If we just look at the last 30 days of precipitation, I mean, there's those areas that I called out earlier in the soil moisture deficits, areas along the Midwest. Ohio River Valley just recently got some more precipitation, but the Gulf Coast states over in the Carolinas. There's a number of areas in here dealing with this fall drought. Now, I'm going to take this forecast. This is the 500 millibar height pattern from the CMWF AIFS. I'm going to try to move this. Let's get it valid about 7 a.m. Central Time. There's that vigorous trough that we talked about, the broader downstream ridge. What goes down goes up. Melda, Umberto here. Play this forecast forward Wednesday into Thursday. You see this trough weaken a bit as it settles in across the western U.S. Friday into Saturday. Sunday, getting out into the northern plains. We talked about that sort of relatively narrow band of solid rainfall accumulations. We've now replaced that vigorous trough across the Northeast Pacific with this ridge here. It's losing maybe a little bit of that omega look. Still has it here, but maybe not as proper of an omega block as maybe we saw yesterday. It's still certainly a bit blocky. But that trough lingers here. We still see a relatively blocked up pattern in the North Pacific, more so like a Rex block here. That's just a high over a low rather than the kind of omega look. And then this just kind of these spinning troughs here across the western U.S. Warmth and ridging to the east. This takes us all the way out to October 8th. So more heat coming in for the central U.S. Drier conditions, more likely than not. We talked about that in kind of the 7-day forecast. We'll look a bit longer in just a second. Perhaps a system getting through late next week into the northern plains. And as I take this further out, starting to see at least more troughing get into the northern plains. Eric talked yesterday, at least if you looked well out into the forecast, some of the model runs, the AIFS included, were showing colder temperatures, even getting down toward frost territory through the Canadian Prairie into the northern plains as you took this forecast all the way out to like next weekend, not this weekend, but next. And part of the scenario playing out here, believe it or not, where I want you to look as I replay this, it's not here, it's not even over here in the North Pacific. Because really we've had a ridge throughout this whole forecast, but what has allowed this trough to build in here is actually what's happening at the top of the screen. So I'm going to take this back to like the beginning of next week. So let's do like Sunday to Monday, August 5th. So here's the ridge. We have this downstream trough. We have the ridge to the east. So take this forecast forward. You're going to see this ridge build in. But critically, for like the archipelago here in Greenland, you see these lower heights, this troughing here near the North Pole. And we have strong troughing far to the north, essentially over kind of the polar region here. Well, that tends to allow ridging to build in underneath it. If we're, again, sort of what goes down goes up in the atmosphere serves, almost zonally west to east, right? That holds true, but sometimes it holds true in this direction. So if we have a lot of troughing here across the poles, we think of this as kind of the polar vortex influence later on in winter. We're going to be warmer here, at least more average. Whereas if you get really warm in the poles, or if you bring a lot of ridging or high pressure system in there, that's how you push out some of the cold into some other regions, maybe in the mid latitudes, where a lot of us are living or growing a crop here. So next week, we still see that troughing across the archipelago, across the polar regions, and we stay warm, at least through the middle part of next week. But if you watch some of the ridging here, you'll notice through the end of next week that this gets pushed well up into the Arctic here. We're kind of moving a lot of momentum up into the Arctic, and that's allowing that troughing to push out into the Hudson Bay. When we get Hudson Bay troughs, we get a lot of flow like this, maybe over the Northeast. That can bring temperatures down. But now over Canada, over like Alaska, seeing ridging build in more so here. And that ends up pushing all the way up into the polar regions, allowing some of this cooler air to get and spill out into the continental U.S., into the Canadian prairie by the end of next week. Now, this is just the AFS scenario. I've also taken this forecast well past 10 days at this point. So it is just one scenario. It's not me saying, okay, here comes this big cooler shot of air on October 12th. But at least that scenario is here in the long-range part of the models from the AFS. And it's not an uncommon scenario for disrupting that cool air, this kind of more polar vortex scheme or paradigm that we expect more so over winter than the middle part of October. But, is it an early inclination of a pattern that we're going to repeat later winter, where this North Pacific warm is actually helping to break down the polar vortex and shove some of this colder air into the continental U.S., like we're seeing play out. So here's that kind of polar vortex scenario where you have it stacked up here across the polar regions. There's that troughing that we talked about, but something comes in from the North Pacific, just like we saw ridging pushing in to the Arctic, that helps to displace that cool air like we saw in the AFS scenario. That is often how we get some of these, anomalous snowfall events or some of these big, low pressure or low temperature records occurring, in January or February. Another thing we kind of watch in relation to that is snow cover across Siberia and or even in Canada later in the year, but early in fall, we often look at snow cover here. So this is the Rutgers Snow Lab. We can see it's valid as of yesterday on Monday. We have decent snow cover actually across Siberia right now for late September. In fact, we can look at this compared to average rather than just absolute. If we go over to departure, we can see in these blue pixels here right now above average snow cover in this region here. And we sometimes watch it here. We watch for snow cover here later in fall and winter across the Canadian prairie as kind of a reservoir for cold air for one reason. But also when we get that kind of nice pairing between the two, we can actually elongate the polar vortex along a line, maybe a line like that, and allow cooler air to spill out maybe into the Midwest or the East Coast, producing a more active winter, especially if we sometimes get lower snow values here, because that kind of pinches the polar vortex route from like both sides, where we have the warmth in the North Pacific. If we get snowfall deficits in northern Europe, that can elongate the polar vortex, allow some of that cross-polar flow to occur, and maybe a colder or at least more active winter in the U.S. Again, just a thought experiment right now playing out. We see this a little bit actually in the GFS forecast for that polar vortex. Again, not typically something we're too focused on in October, but if we look at the forecast here from the polar vortex, what I'm looking at is the troughing over here. We're way up in the stratosphere at 10 millibars, looking well up at the upper atmosphere here. Now I'm going to take the forecast out. This is September 30th from the GFS. And the polar vortex, it predictably deepens. So if you see that troughing deepening as we go toward winter, that deepens all the while. But you notice we actually have a little bit of warming here, the polar vortex relatively speaking, over Alaska. And we start to see a little bit of that elongation that I talked about, getting out toward like the 11th and the 12th. You notice that how it's getting pinched, kind of squeezed with that cooler signature getting closer and closer to the Canadian prairie as that warming occurred over Alaska. So you see how that kind of occurs middle part of the next week. Now this is a different model than the AFS. It's the GFS, right? So kind of lending some credence at least to that ECMWF AFS scenario. And if I take this forecast even all the way out to like the 12th, now the 13th, seeing some cooler air, right? Certainly down toward the freezing line, pushing out of the prairie into the northern plains, maybe even over to the Midwest. This is all the way out now, October 15th. We're certainly in fantasy land as far as the models are concerned, all the way out, 15 days from now. But at least a scenario we see playing out from the GFS and the AFS. If we go way out in the ECMWF ENS, we're not quite seeing the same obvious signal, but that's because these ensembles often wash it out. We are seeing that stronger ridging over the North Pacific, some troughing here of the Canadian prairie across the Northwest, at least bringing the temperatures down. Some of that ridging still maybe lingering across the Canadian Maritimes and the eastern U.S. Not as obvious as of a signal here, but at least with this troughing getting into the northern plains, perhaps giving some better chances for precipitation across the upper Midwest. We can see some of that. If we jump over and look at the ECMWF ensemble, the 8 to 14 day precipitation anomalies, near normal across the Canadian Prairie. Maybe better precipitation signal here across the upper Midwest, Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin. Maybe not quite as dry across this kind of whole corridor here, but we do see that dry signature continuing across the southern Mississippi River Valley, the Red River of the South, and then maybe the ECMWF picking up on something coming out of the East Pacific, getting into the Southwest in October, getting out of their wet season at this point as the monsoon has all but disappeared, but maybe something coming out of the East Pacific that we'll have to keep an eye on here. If we look at long-range temperatures, actually before I do that, I want to look at some of those other models. The AFS being a little bit more aggressive with that scenario that we talked about. Actually goes over much wetter to the upper Midwest, even into Ontario, over toward the Dakotas, through Missouri. Something maybe coming up out of the Gulf into the southern Mississippi River Valley. We'll talk about that potential in just a second here. This is definitely the wetter of the three in the long range right now. The GFS ensemble, generally a little bit closer to seasonal across the Midwest for precipitation, getting toward the middle of October here, kind of drier in the eastern prairie and the northern plains. Maybe something again coming up out of the eastern Pacific, and then we'll have to watch that Gulf potential that we talked about. The GFS ensemble not showing it getting up into like Louisiana, Arkansas, or Louisiana, but at least we see those higher precipitation values there. Now temperatures, just jump back from this, certainly over the next 5 days, warmth underneath that ridge across Canada, the Central Plains, the Northern Plains, the Midwest, much of the continental U.S. That continues next week, at least the early part of next week, right, with the Midwest staying warm, even portions of the prairie, all the way over through the southern U.S. into the eastern U.S. The influence of that trough can be seen kind of lingering across the western U.S. But then when you get out day 10 to 15, the ECMWF ensemble cooler for the prairie, cooler into the northern plains with that freeze potential. The GFS ensemble consistent with that, actually a little bit cooler over into the Midwest and the East Coast now. And then the ECMWF AFS, the most aggressive with that cooler scenario that I talked about, the most wettest of the three again. For the Midwest, going over much cooler across the prairie, the northern plains. In fact, pretty cold from that forecast here. So there's at least this potential. And if you look closely at some of these, look at the warmth getting up into that Arctic region. It's that sort of yin-yang that we talked about. When this goes warm, we often go cold here. When you get high pressure here, you often get lower pressure here. When you get high heights and urging here, you can often get troughs and more active weather to the south. So watching that kind of dichotomy between the two as we get out into the middle of October, see if that signal holds. Now, I did mention, wanted to look at the tropical potential for the Gulf. I'm looking at the GFS ensemble because of the three right now, it maybe shows the most robust signal for potentially something coming out of the Gulf as we get into the middle of next week. There's not a lot of the ensemble members showing that scenario right now, but it's enough of them to start to tick up some of the precipitation values down here. If you look over at the ECMWF AIFS, maybe you can see something here. Again, this is all the way up to like next weekend. The ECMWF ensemble does not show much of the three. In fact, I'm not even going to look at it and waste some time there. So the GFS and the AFS showing maybe something in the Gulf near the end or middle part of next week. It's not a robust signal right now, but just something that Eric and I have noticed, and we'll keep an eye on as we go through. I did want to jump over and see. We'll look at the East Pacific here just for a minute. We do have some areas that the National Hurricane Center is watching. We did see in some of the longer range forecasts that maybe the remnants of these try to get up into the Southwest. Not all the model scenarios playing out with that right now, but it's something we'll keep an eye on next week. But these aren't expected to be a major landfall threat, obviously, for like California or Hawaii right now. And the last thing I wanted to check is if we can get a longer look at the ECMWF weeklies. And for precipitation, I can imagine that we'll see a little bit of a wetter signal. Let's take it out through like November 5th for the upper Midwest. Yeah, we can see that here. Drier without a tropical system across the Ohio River Valley and through the southern Mississippi River Valley. If we go from October 5th through November 5th for those precipitation anomalies. But I'm curious to look at temperature as we go further out in the forecast. Not seeing that kind of colder scenario play out. Sometimes it helps if we jump over to the 7-day forecast. Play this out through the middle part of October. Yeah, you don't see that sort of cooler scenario play out from the ECMWF extended, just kind of right there in the ECMWF AIFS more so. So we'll have to see how those play out kind of over the next 5 to 10 days as we get a hold on where this pattern's going from. I'll say kind of October 8th through the 15th, that fork in the road where we might see that polar vortex or cool air scenario play out, and then watching the West Pacific potential moisture into the Southwest, and then that Gulf system perhaps to keep an eye on around October 8th through the 13th next week. I'll leave it there. Eric will talk with you all tomorrow. Thanks for watching.